Hello there, friend. Welcome to another journey into the sleepy side of history. Whether it's the middle of the day or the witching hour where you are, I invite you to settle in, get cozy, and let my voice carry you gently off to dreamland. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy floating off to sleep to the hushed tones of history, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. In the year 2025, if you steal something, say a watch or a phone, you might get a fine, maybe a court date. If it's your first time, you might even walk away with just a warning and a second chance. But a few hundred years ago, things were very different. Back in medieval times, stealing didn't just cost you money, it could cost you a hand or your life. Now, let's set the scene, shall we? Picture this. The sun rising over the cobblestone streets of a medieval town, casting long shadows across the marketplace where a crowd has already begun to gather. But this isn't a market day celebration or a festival of any kind. No, this is something far darker. The people have come to witness justice, medieval style, and what they're about to see would make even the most hardened modern observer turn away in horror. Tonight, we're diving into the worst punishments in medieval history, the tortures, the executions, the creative cruelties that medieval minds devised to maintain order and exact revenge. But here's the thing that might surprise you. Many of these punishments weren't considered particularly barbaric by the standards of their time. They were simply part of life, part of the social contract, part of the way the world worked when might made right, and mercy was a luxury few could afford. You see, in medieval times, punishment wasn't just about justice, it was about spectacle, about sending a message, about reminding everyone who held the power and what happened when you crossed them. The public square wasn't just where you bought your bread and sold your wares. It was where you learned, often in the most visceral way possible, about the consequences of stepping out of line. Now, before we get too deep into the darker corners of medieval justice, let's take a moment to understand the world these punishments existed in. This wasn't our world of rehabilitation and reform. This was a world where survival was uncertain, where life was often short and brutal, where the line between civilization and chaos was maintained through fear as much as faith. The medieval justice system, if we can even call it that, was a patchwork of local customs, royal decrees, and church law. There was no unified legal code, no standardized procedures, no appeals process as we understand it today. Justice was often swift, public, and deliberately terrifying. The idea wasn't necessarily to fit the punishment to the crime, but to make sure everyone understood what happened when you broke the rules. But here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. When we compare medieval punishments to modern justice systems, we're not just looking at different methods, we're looking at entirely different philosophies about what punishment should accomplish. Today, we talk about deterrence, rehabilitation, and restorative justice. Medieval minds thought in terms of retribution, divine judgment, and public order. Take, for example, the simple act of theft. In our modern world, stealing a loaf of bread might result in a fine community service, or perhaps a short jail sentence. In medieval times, that same theft could cost you a hand, or even your life, depending on the circumstances and the mood of whoever was dispensing justice that day. Not because medieval people were inherently more cruel, but because they lived in a world where resources were scarce and social order was fragile. The punishments we're going to explore tonight weren't aberrations or exceptions. They were the norm. They were how medieval society maintained itself, how it dealt with crime, dissent, and disorder. And while they may seem shockingly brutal to our modern sensibilities, they made perfect sense to the people who devised and carried them out. Consider the pillory, one of the more common medieval punishments. This wasn't just about physical discomfort, though there was certainly plenty of that. The real punishment was the humiliation, the public shame, the way it marked you as someone who had transgressed against the community. You weren't just suffering physically. You were being stripped of your social standing, your reputation, your place in the carefully ordered hierarchy of medieval life. Or think about the ducking stool, used primarily for punishing women who were considered scolds or gossips. Again, the physical punishment was only part of it. The real message was about controlling speech, about maintaining social order, about reminding everyone that there were consequences for disrupting the peace, even with words. But perhaps most telling of all is how these punishments reflected the deep inequalities of medieval society. A nobleman might face a fine or a brief period of house arrest for the same crime that would see a peasant hanged or burned alive. Justice wasn't blind in medieval times. It was acutely aware of social status, wealth, and connections. The church, too, played a crucial role in medieval punishment. Heresy, blasphemy, and other religious crimes were often punished with particular severity, not just because they offended God, but because they threatened the very foundation of medieval society. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was a political and economic powerhouse, and challenges to its authority were dealt with accordingly. What's fascinating, though, is how creative medieval minds could be when it came to devising punishments. They didn't just settle for simple execution or imprisonment. They invented elaborate tortures, complex humiliations, punishments that were almost artistic in their cruelty. The rack, the iron maiden, the breaking wheel. These weren't just tools of torture. They were statements about power, about order, about what happened when you challenged the established way of things. And yet, for all their apparent brutality, these punishments existed within a moral framework that made sense to the people of the time. They weren't random acts of cruelty. They were part of a system of justice that, however flawed, provided structure and order to medieval society. They were, in their own twisted way, attempts to create a just world, even if their methods strike us as anything but just today. As we continue our journey through the darker corners of medieval history, we'll explore specific punishments, the crimes that warranted them, and the social forces that shaped them. We'll see how justice was dispensed in castle courts and village squares, how it differed between regions and time periods, and how it reflected the values and fears of medieval society. But more than that, we'll see how these medieval approaches to punishment laid the groundwork for our modern justice system. The principles of public trial, proportional punishment, and legal representation that we take for granted today all have their roots in the medieval period, even if they've evolved almost beyond recognition. So settle back, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey into a world where justice wore a very different face than it does today. A world where punishment was theatre, where pain was pedagogy, and where the worst crimes called for the worst punishments medieval minds could devise. The crowds are gathering in the square. The executioner is sharpening his blade. And somewhere in the distance, church bells are tolling, marking time in a world where time itself might be running out for those who dared to break the law. Welcome to medieval justice, where mercy was rare and the punishment truly fit the crime, no matter how terrible that fit might be. Let the weight of the day fall away like sand through your fingers. You're not here, not really. Not in your comfortable modern bed with its soft sheets and central heating. No. You're walking now through the cobblestone streets of a medieval town where the air is thick with smoke and the scent of unwashed bodies, where justice is about to be served in the most public and permanent way possible. The year is 1347, and you've arrived just in time for what the townspeople are calling the most spectacular execution in living memory. But this isn't just about ending a life. This is about sending a message, about maintaining order, about reminding everyone exactly what happens when you cross the line from citizen to criminal in a world where the line itself is drawn in blood. Medieval execution wasn't the clinical, supposedly humane process we associate with capital punishment today. There were no last meals, no final statements, no attempts to minimize suffering. Instead, execution was theatre, carefully choreographed to maximize both the physical agony of the condemned and the psychological impact on the watching crowd. The most common method, of course, was hanging, but even this seemingly straightforward punishment had its variations and refinements. The standard hanging wasn't designed to break the neck cleanly and cause instant death. Instead, the condemned would be strung up to slowly strangle, dancing what was grimly called the hangman's jig, as they fought for breath that would never come. The process could take anywhere from several minutes to half an hour, depending on the weight of the condemned and the skill of the executioner. But for truly serious crimes, simple hanging was considered far too merciful. This is where we encounter the punishment known as hanging, drawing, and quartering, reserved for those convicted of high treason against the crown. The condemned would first be dragged through the streets tied to a horse's tail, already half dead from the journey. Then they would be hanged until nearly dead, but cut down while still conscious. What followed was disembowelment while still alive, with the entrails burned before the victim's eyes. Finally, the body would be chopped into quarters and the pieces displayed in prominent locations throughout the realm as a warning to others. The execution of William Wallace in 1305 provides a particularly vivid example of this punishment in action. After his capture, Wallace was dragged naked through the streets of London tied to a horse's tail. He was then hanged until nearly dead, disemboweled while still alive, and finally beheaded and quartered. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, while his limbs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness the consequences of defying the English crown. For women, burning was often the preferred method of execution, particularly for crimes like witchcraft, heresy, or husband murder. The reasoning was partly practical. It was considered indecent to publicly hang a woman, and partly symbolic. Fire was seen as purifying, capable of burning away sin and corruption, but the reality was anything but purifying. Women condemned to burn would often be strangled first as an act of mercy, but this wasn't always the case. Those who burned alive experienced unimaginable agony as the flames slowly consumed them from the feet upward. The execution of Joan of Arc in 1431 remains one of the most famous examples of burning in medieval history. Condemned as a heretic and witch by an English-controlled court, Joan was burned alive in the marketplace of Rouen. Witnesses reported that she called out the name of Jesus repeatedly as the flames consumed her, and that her heart was found intact among the ashes, which was taken as either a sign of her sanctity or her supernatural powers, depending on one's perspective. But perhaps the most creative and terrifying executions were those designed specifically to match the crime. These punishments reflected the medieval belief in poetic justice, the idea that the manner of death should somehow reflect the nature of the offence. Counterfeiters might be boiled alive in oil or molten metal. Those who poisoned others might be forced to drink their own poison. Murderers might be killed in the same manner they had used on their victims. One particularly inventive punishment was reserved for those who killed their parents, considered one of the most heinous crimes in medieval society. The condemned would be sewn into a leather sack, along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, then thrown into a river or the sea. The theory was that these animals, representing different aspects of base nature, would tear the criminal apart in a frenzy of fear and violence, creating a death that matched the unnaturalness of the crime. The breaking wheel was another favoured method for the worst criminals. The condemned would be tied to a large wheel and systematically beaten with iron bars, breaking bones in a specific sequence designed to maximise suffering while prolonging life. A skilled executioner could keep the victim alive for hours or even days, breaking limbs in such a way that the victim remained conscious throughout the ordeal. The broken body would then be woven through the spokes of the wheel and hoisted up on a pole, where the victim would remain until death finally came from exposure, thirst, or shock. What made these executions particularly effective as deterrents wasn't just their brutality, but their public nature. Entire towns would turn out to watch, treating executions as a form of entertainment. Children were encouraged to attend, the better to learn the consequences of criminal behaviour. Vendors sold food and drink to the crowds. Balladeers composed songs about the condemned. The whole event became a carnival of death, with the suffering of the condemned serving as both warning and entertainment for the masses. The spectacle served multiple purposes beyond mere deterrence. It reinforced social hierarchies, demonstrated the power of the authorities, and provided a kind of cathartic release for communities that had been traumatized by crime. In a world where life was often uncertain and violent, public executions offered a sense that justice was being done, that order was being maintained, that the universe itself was being set right through the suffering of the guilty. But perhaps most importantly, these public executions served to reinforce the medieval worldview that saw suffering as meaningful, punishment as necessary, and death as a transition rather than an ending. The condemned weren't just being killed, they were being judged, weighed, and found wanting. Their death served a cosmic purpose, restoring balance to a world that had been thrown into chaos by their crimes. The crowds that gathered to watch weren't just seeking entertainment or education. They were participating in a ritual as old as civilization itself, the ritual of casting out the transgressor, of purifying the community through the elimination of corruption. They were witnesses to justice, participants in the maintenance of order, guardians of the moral boundaries that kept society from sliding into chaos. As the sun sets on our medieval town and the last of the crowd disperses, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and the memory of what they've witnessed, we're reminded that these weren't aberrations or exceptions. This was how justice worked in a world where order was fragile and mercy was a luxury few could afford. These were the worst punishments medieval minds could devise, and they were considered not just necessary, but righteous. The executioner cleans his tools and heads home to his family. The condemned are beyond suffering now, their bodies serving as silent warnings to any who might consider following their path. And tomorrow, life in the medieval town will continue much as it always has, ordered by fear, structured by hierarchy, and governed by the understanding that some lines must never be crossed. Let the sounds of the medieval world fade now, the cries of the crowd growing distant, the smoke dispersing in the evening breeze. You're safe in your own time, in your own bed, where justice wears a gentler face and punishment seeks to heal rather than merely harm. Sleep now and let the harsh realities of medieval justice become nothing more than shadows in the comfortable darkness of your modern world. Medieval justice was a spectacle designed to terrify, but beneath the theatrical cruelty lay a complex system of beliefs about crime, punishment, and cosmic order. In our modern world, we lock criminals away, hoping rehabilitation might transform them into productive citizens. We debate the ethics of capital punishment and worry about prison conditions. But in medieval times, punishment wasn't about rehabilitation or even deterrence in the way we understand it. It was about public display, divine justice, and maintaining the delicate balance between earthly authority and heavenly law. The medieval mind saw crime not just as an offence against society, but as a disruption of God's natural order. When someone stole bread, they weren't just taking food from another person. They were defying the divine hierarchy that placed some people as masters and others as servants. When someone committed adultery, they weren't just betraying their spouse. They were corrupting the sacred institution of marriage that God Himself had ordained. Every crime, no matter how small, sent ripples through the cosmic order that had to be corrected through equally dramatic means. This is why medieval punishments often seem to match the crime in disturbingly literal ways. Thieves had their hands cut off because those hands had taken what wasn't theirs. Liars had their tongues pierced or removed because those tongues had spoken falsehoods. Adulterers were sometimes forced to run naked through the streets because they had exposed their shameful desires. The punishment became a kind of divine poetry written in flesh and blood. Consider the punishment for treason, which was considered the most heinous crime imaginable because it struck at the very foundation of medieval society. The traitor wasn't simply executed, he was hanged, drawn, and quartered. First, he would be dragged through the streets on a hurdle so the entire community could see his shame. Then he would be hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive. His abdomen would be sliced open, his intestines removed and burned before his eyes. Finally, his body would be hacked into quarters, and those pieces displayed at the gates of the city as a warning to others. This wasn't mindless brutality. Every step of the process had meaning. The dragging represented the traitor's fall from grace. The hanging symbolized his rejection by heaven. The disemboweling showed that his corruption ran so deep, it had to be literally carved out of his body. And the quartering ensured that he could never be properly buried, condemning his soul to wander in torment. It was theatre, but theatre with a deadly serious purpose. But perhaps even more revealing than these extreme punishments were the everyday forms of medieval justice that ordinary people encountered. The stocks and pillory, those wooden restraints that held criminals in the town square, weren't just about physical discomfort. They were about shame. A person locked in the stocks became a public spectacle, pelted with rotten vegetables, jeered at by children, spat upon by their neighbours. The real punishment wasn't the wooden restraints. It was the complete destruction of their social standing. Medieval society was built on reputation and honour. To be publicly shamed was often worse than death, because it meant you could no longer function in your community. Your neighbours wouldn't trade with you, your family might disown you, and your children would carry the stain of your disgrace. The stocks didn't just punish the criminal, they reminded everyone watching that their own social position was fragile, dependent on maintaining the approval of their betters. The church played a crucial role in this system of justice, not just as a moral authority, but as an active participant in punishment. Ecclesiastical courts handled crimes involving morality, marriage, and spiritual matters. They had their own arsenal of punishments, often focused on public humiliation rather than physical pain. A woman caught in adultery might be forced to walk through the streets in her undergarments, carrying a candle, and confessing her sins to anyone who would listen. A man who skipped church might be sentenced to fast for weeks while performing public penance. But the church's influence went deeper than just handling religious crimes. Medieval people believed that earthly justice had to reflect divine justice. When a criminal was executed, it wasn't enough for the state to take their life. Their soul had to be prepared for judgment. This is why condemned prisoners were always given the opportunity to confess their sins and receive last rites. The execution became a religious ceremony, with priests offering salvation even as the executioner prepared his instruments. This blending of spiritual and temporal authority created some truly bizarre situations. In some regions, criminals could claim sanctuary in churches, making them temporarily immune from prosecution. A murderer who reached the altar before his pursuers could stay there for up to 40 days, during which time he might negotiate safe passage out of the kingdom. The church became a literal refuge, but one that came with its own price. The criminal would have to confess his crimes publicly, renounce his property, and often agree to go into permanent exile. These sanctuary laws reveal something important about medieval justice. It wasn't primarily concerned with punishment for its own sake, but with restoring social order. If a criminal fled the kingdom, the immediate problem was solved. The community was safe, the victim's family might feel some satisfaction, and the cosmic balance was restored. Whether the criminal suffered appropriately was less important than whether the disruption he had caused was corrected. This pragmatic approach to justice extended to the treatment of different social classes. A noble who committed murder faced very different consequences than a peasant who committed the same crime. The noble might be sentenced to pay compensation to the victim's family, go on a pilgrimage, or at worst face a relatively quick beheading. The peasant would likely be hanged, perhaps after being tortured to extract a confession. This wasn't seen as unfair, because medieval people didn't believe in equality before the law. They believed in hierarchy, and that hierarchy extended even to crime and punishment. The reasoning was that a noble's crime was somehow less serious, because nobles were naturally superior beings. Their blood was purer, their souls more refined, their understanding of right and wrong more sophisticated. When they committed crimes, it was seen as a temporary lapse in judgment rather than evidence of fundamental moral corruption. Peasants, on the other hand, were viewed as naturally prone to sin and violence. Their crimes were seen as inevitable expressions of their base nature, requiring harsh correction. This class-based system of justice created some remarkable contradictions. A noble who raped a peasant woman might escape with a fine, while the woman herself could face punishment for adultery if she was married. A lord who cheated his tenants out of their harvest might be required to make restitution, while a peasant who stole a single loaf of bread could lose his hand. Justice wasn't blind in medieval times. It was carefully calibrated to preserve existing power structures. Yet within this system of inequality and brutality, there were occasionally moments of something approaching mercy. Some judges developed reputations for creative punishments that avoided bloodshed while still making their point. A baker who short-weighted his bread might be sentenced to be pelted with his own loaves. A miller who cheated his customers might be forced to eat nothing but the poor quality flour he had been selling. These punishments were still public humiliations, but they avoided the permanent maiming or death that characterized harsher sentences. Medieval punishments also reflected the limited understanding of human psychology and behavior that characterized the age. Mental illness was often seen as demonic possession, leading to treatments that were indistinguishable from torture. Criminals were viewed as fundamentally evil rather than products of their circumstances, making rehabilitation impossible to conceive. The idea that crime might be caused by poverty, desperation, or social injustice was largely foreign to medieval thinking. Instead, criminals were seen as people who had chosen evil over good, often with the assistance of supernatural forces. This is why so many punishments involved religious elements, from forced pilgrimages to public confessions. The goal wasn't just to punish the body, but to save the soul, to drive out whatever evil influences had led the person to crime in the first place. The role of the community in medieval punishment cannot be overstated. Public executions weren't just entertainment, though they certainly served that function in a world with few diversions. They were communal rituals that reinforced shared values and collective identity. When a crowd gathered to watch a hanging, they weren't just witnessing the death of a criminal. They were participating in a ceremony that reminded them who they were and what they stood for. The crowd's reaction was carefully monitored by authorities. If the people seemed sympathetic to the condemned, it might indicate that the punishment was too harsh or that the criminal had been wrongly accused. If they seemed bloodthirsty, it might suggest that social order was breaking down and that more severe measures were needed. The execution became a kind of public opinion poll, conducted in the most dramatic way possible. This community involvement extended to the administration of justice itself. Many punishments required active participation from ordinary citizens. When someone was sentenced to run the gauntlet, it was their neighbours who wielded the sticks and stones. When someone was put in the stocks, it was local children who threw the rotten fruit. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a way of making the entire community complicit in the maintenance of order. By participating in punishment, people became invested in the system that produced it. They couldn't simply stand apart and criticize, because they had played a role in carrying out the sentence. This created a kind of collective responsibility that helped maintain social cohesion, even as it normalized levels of violence that would horrify modern observers. The physical infrastructure of medieval punishment was designed to be both functional and symbolic. Gallows were often built at crossroads, where the maximum number of people would see them. They were constructed to last, serving as permanent reminders of the consequences of crime. The bodies of executed criminals were sometimes left hanging for weeks or months, slowly decomposing in full view of passers-by. These rotting corpses served multiple purposes. They warned potential criminals of what awaited them. They satisfied the desire for revenge among the victims' families, and they demonstrated the power of earthly authority. But they also served a spiritual function, reminding viewers of the inevitability of death and the importance of living righteously. In a world where most people couldn't read, these visual displays served as powerful moral lessons. The tools of medieval punishment were often works of craftsmanship in their own right. Executioners' axes were carefully balanced and sharpened to ensure a clean cut. Torture devices were engineered with precision to maximize pain while avoiding immediate death. Even the ropes used for hanging were prepared according to specific traditions, with the number of coils and the placement of the knot carrying symbolic meaning. This attention to detail reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward punishment. It wasn't casual or careless, but deliberate and ritualized. Every aspect of the process was carefully considered and imbued with meaning. The punishment became a kind of sacred drama, with each participant playing a prescribed role in a cosmic struggle between good and evil. As we've seen, medieval punishment was far more than simple retribution. It was a complex system of social control, spiritual guidance, and public theatre that reflected the deepest beliefs and values of medieval society. While we may recoil from its brutality, we can also recognize the sophisticated thinking that lay behind it. Medieval people weren't simply more violent than we are. They lived in a world where violence was seen as a necessary tool for maintaining the delicate balance between order and chaos, between heaven and earth, between justice and mercy. In our next exploration, we'll delve deeper into the specific methods of medieval punishment, examining how different crimes were matched with different penalties, and how the medieval imagination created an entire catalogue of creative cruelties designed to fit the crime. We'll see how punishment became an art form, albeit one painted in blood and tears, and how the quest for perfect justice led to some of the most inventive and horrifying spectacles in human history. The elaborate nature of medieval punishment extended far beyond simple execution or physical torment. These were theatrical productions designed to extract maximum meaning from human suffering, performances where the condemned played their final role before an audience hungry for both entertainment and moral instruction. Consider the punishment known as drawing and quartering, reserved for those guilty of high treason against the crown. This wasn't merely execution, it was a carefully choreographed destruction of the human form. The condemned would first be dragged through the streets on a hurdle, a wooden frame that ensured maximum contact with the filth and stones of medieval roads. The journey itself was part of the punishment, a mobile exhibition of royal justice. Upon reaching the place of execution, the real performance began. The victim would be hanged, but not to death. Instead, they would be cut down while still conscious, still breathing, still capable of experiencing what came next. The executioner would then slice open the abdomen and remove the intestines, while the condemned watched their own body being dismantled. Only then would they be beheaded, their head held aloft for the crowd to see. Finally, the body would be carved into 4 quarters, each piece sent to a different part of the kingdom as a warning. But even this elaborate ritual paled in comparison to some of the more creative punishments devised by medieval minds. Take the practice of flaying, where the skin would be carefully peeled from the living body in strips. This required considerable skill from the executioner, as the goal was to keep the victim conscious for as long as possible. The removed skin might then be displayed in the town square, or even fashioned into leather goods, transforming the condemned into a permanent reminder of royal justice. The medieval world also perfected the art of symbolic punishment, where the method of execution reflected the nature of the crime. Counterfeiters might have molten gold poured down their throats. Those guilty of spreading sedition could have their tongues torn out with red-hot pincers before being executed. Arsonists were sometimes burned alive, their own bodies becoming the fuel for the flames they had once wielded against others. These punishments were not random acts of cruelty, but carefully designed systems of meaning. Every aspect carried symbolic weight, from the location of the execution to the tools used to carry it out. A scaffold built at a crossroads ensured maximum visibility and sent the message that justice reached into every corner of the realm. The use of specific implements, blessed by priests and maintained by guild craftsmen, transformed simple tools into instruments of divine will. The timing of executions was equally deliberate. Market days guaranteed the largest possible audience, while holy festivals added religious significance to the proceedings. Some executions were delayed for months, not out of mercy, but to coincide with important dates in the church calendar or significant events in the royal court. The condemned became props in a larger theatrical production, their deaths timed to maximize both spectacle and symbolic impact. But perhaps most telling was the medieval fascination with keeping the condemned alive for as long as possible during their punishment. This wasn't sadism, though sadistic pleasure was certainly present among the spectators. It was theology made flesh. The longer the suffering lasted, the more complete the spiritual cleansing was believed to be. Pain wasn't just punishment, it was purification. The screams weren't just expressions of agony, they were prayers forced from unwilling lips. The crowds that gathered for these spectacles weren't merely bloodthirsty mobs, though bloodthirst was certainly present. They were congregations participating in a religious service, witnesses to the cosmic order being restored. Children were brought to watch, not out of cruelty, but out of education. These displays were considered essential moral instruction, teaching the young what happened to those who challenged the divine hierarchy that governed their world. The condemned themselves often played their parts with surprising cooperation. Many would confess publicly, not because they were guilty, but because confession was part of the ritual expected of them. They would thank their executioners, praise the justice of their sentence, and ask the crowd to pray for their souls. This wasn't Stockholm Syndrome. It was the final performance demanded by a society that had transformed judicial murder into sacred theatre. The aftermath of these executions was as carefully orchestrated as the events themselves. The body parts weren't simply disposed of, they were distributed according to specific protocols. Heads might be placed on spikes above city gates, where they would remain until they rotted away completely. Arms and legs could be sent to other towns as warnings, carried by special messengers whose job was to ensure the maximum number of people saw what happened to traitors and criminals. Even the families of the condemned were not spared. In many cases, they were required to pay for the execution, purchasing the rope, the wood for the scaffold, even the services of the executioner. This wasn't merely adding insult to injury, it was forcing the family to participate in their own humiliation. They became accomplices in the destruction of their loved one, their payment transforming them from victims into collaborators. The Church played an essential role in legitimizing these spectacles, providing both the theological framework and the ritual structure that transformed simple murder into divine justice. Priests would bless the instruments of execution, hear final confessions, and lead the crowd in prayers for the soul of the condemned. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was the logical extension of a worldview that saw earthly suffering as preparation for eternal judgment. The medieval mind made no distinction between spiritual and physical punishment because it recognized no separation between body and soul. To break the body was to instruct the spirit. To humiliate the flesh was to educate the community. Every scream was a sermon, every drop of blood a lesson in the consequences of challenging the established order. These elaborate punishments served multiple functions simultaneously. They entertained a population with few other sources of spectacle. They educated the masses about the consequences of transgression. They reinforced the authority of both church and crown. And they provided a ritualized outlet for the violence that simmered beneath the surface of medieval society. But perhaps most importantly, they created a shared experience of witnessing divine justice at work. The crowd that gathered to watch an execution wasn't just observing punishment. They were participating in a collective affirmation of the moral order that governed their world. They were saying yes to the hierarchy that placed kings above subjects, men above women, Christians above heretics, and the powerful above the powerless. The elaborate nature of medieval punishment reflected a society's deepest beliefs about justice, authority, and the nature of human existence itself. These weren't primitive expressions of barely controlled savagery. They were sophisticated theological statements carved in flesh and bone. They represented the pinnacle of a civilization that had perfected the art of transforming human suffering into sacred meaning. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval romance wasn't the physical dangers or social constraints we've explored. It was the pervasive belief that love itself might be the work of dark supernatural forces. In a world where devils whispered from every shadow and witches were believed to brew potions under moonlit skies, the very act of falling in love was viewed with deep suspicion and mortal fear. Picture, if you will, a young merchant's daughter named Isabel in 14th century France. When she began displaying the telltale signs of romantic infatuation, gazing dreamily into the distance, losing her appetite, speaking in passionate whispers about the baker's son, her family didn't see the natural bloom of young love. Instead, they saw unmistakable symptoms of demonic possession or supernatural enchantment. This wasn't an isolated incident of paranoid overreaction. Medieval medical texts actually described romantic love as a dangerous form of mental illness called love sickness, or erotic melancholy. The symptoms they listed, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts about the beloved, were indeed real. But their understanding of the cause was filtered through a worldview that saw demonic influence behind every strong emotion. The Church played a particularly sinister role in fostering these supernatural terrors. Religious authorities routinely preached that romantic love represented a dangerous departure from proper Christian devotion. They warned that passionate feelings could open the soul to demonic influence, making lovers vulnerable to Satan's temptations. Young people were taught to be suspicious of their own emotions, to view romantic desire as potentially sinful or even diabolical. This religious paranoia created a climate where expressing romantic feelings became an act of considerable courage. A young man composing love poetry risked being accused of practicing dark arts. A woman who showed too much enthusiasm for a suitor might find herself suspected of witchcraft. The very intensity that makes love beautiful became, in medieval minds, evidence of supernatural corruption. The fear of love magic pervaded every level of society. Wealthy nobles employed food tasters not just to guard against poison, but to detect love potions that might compromise their judgment in marriage negotiations. Merchants kept careful watch over their daughters. worried that rivals might use supernatural means to manipulate romantic attachments for business advantage. Even peasants lived in terror that their romantic rivals might employ cunning women or wise men to cast spells that would steal away their beloved's affections. These fears weren't entirely baseless within the medieval worldview. A thriving underground economy existed around love magic, with cunning folk, hedge witches, and folk healers offering potions, charms, and spells designed to kindle, enhance, or destroy romantic feelings. While these practitioners were often simply herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or psychological manipulation, medieval society saw them as wielding genuinely supernatural powers. The consequences of this superstitious terror were devastating for ordinary people trying to navigate romance. Young lovers found themselves caught between their natural feelings and a society that viewed those feelings as potentially demonic. They had to hide their emotions, suppress their passions, and constantly worry that their love might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Consider the diary of Margaret of Wessex, a 15th century wool merchant's daughter. She wrote of her love for a young clerk named Thomas, but her entries are filled with self-doubt and terror. She constantly questioned whether her feelings were natural or the result of some malevolent spell. She prayed daily for God to cleanse her heart of what she feared might be demonic influence. When Thomas began returning her affections, she became convinced that she had somehow corrupted him through supernatural means. This internalized fear created a vicious cycle. The more intensely someone experienced love, the more convinced they became that supernatural forces were at work. This led to guilt, self-loathing, and attempts to suppress or deny romantic feelings. Young people were taught to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. The superstitious terror surrounding love also provided convenient weapons for those seeking to destroy romantic relationships. Jealous rivals could destroy a courtship simply by spreading rumors of love magic. Parents opposed to a match could claim their child had been enchanted. Spurned lovers could seek revenge by accusing their former beloved of practicing witchcraft. These accusations carried terrifying consequences. Suspected practitioners of love magic faced trials that often involved torture designed to extract confessions. The procedures for detecting love magic were barbaric and often fatal. Accused women might be subjected to swimming tests, where they were bound and thrown into water on the theory that witches would float while innocent women would sink. They faced pricking tests, where investigators searched their bodies for supernatural marks that supposedly proved their guilt. Even when formal accusations weren't made, the fear of love magic created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia. Couples had to be extraordinarily careful about how they expressed their feelings, worried that too much passion might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. They lived in fear that rejected suitors or jealous rivals might spread rumors that would destroy not just their relationship, but their reputations and possibly their lives. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating impact of these superstitious terrors on romantic relationships. In case after case, we see love affairs destroyed by accusations of magic. Young women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. The trial records of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in 1566 for witchcraft, illustrate this pattern perfectly. Agnes was accused of using magic to make various men fall in love with her, to break up established relationships, and to cause impotence in men who rejected her advances. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony that she was unusually successful in romantic matters and that several men had developed strong feelings for her. In a society where female romantic agency was viewed with suspicion, Agnes's apparent ability to attract and influence men was interpreted as proof of supernatural powers. This case demonstrates how the superstitious terror surrounding love particularly targeted women. In medieval thinking, women were seen as more susceptible to demonic influence and more likely to use supernatural means to achieve their goals. A woman who was too beautiful, too charming, or too successful in love automatically became suspect. Female romantic agency was so threatening to medieval patriarchal structures that it was literally demonized. The fear of love magic also created terrible situations for women who were naturally attractive or charismatic. Beauty itself became suspect, viewed as potentially supernatural in origin. Women learned to downplay their appearance and suppress their natural charm, worried that too much success in romantic matters might lead to accusations of witchcraft. This superstitious terror extended beyond individual relationships to poison entire communities. Villagers lived in constant fear that cunning women among them might be practicing love magic. Neighbors watched each other suspiciously, looking for signs of supernatural romantic manipulation. The slightest unusual romantic development, a sudden infatuation, an unexpected marriage, a broken engagement, could trigger investigations and accusations. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat cannot be overstated. Young people grew up learning to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic love as potentially dangerous and possibly demonic. They internalized fears that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. How could someone fully open their heart when they'd been taught that romantic passion might be evidence of supernatural corruption? These superstitious terrors also created terrible dilemmas for people experiencing genuine love. They had to choose between following their hearts and protecting themselves from accusations of magic. Many chose safety over love, suppressing their feelings and entering into loveless but socially acceptable marriages. Others risked everything for love, knowing that their passion might be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence. The intersection of superstitious terror with medieval romance reveals the deep-seated fear of female sexuality that permeated medieval society. Women who displayed sexual agency or romantic initiative were automatically suspect. They were seen as potentially using supernatural means to overcome the natural male dominance that medieval society considered proper. This fear of female romantic agency led to the development of elaborate tests and procedures designed to detect supernatural influence in romantic relationships. Church authorities developed questionnaires to determine whether romantic feelings were natural or magically induced. They looked for signs like sudden onset of passion, intensity of feeling, or romantic success that exceeded what they considered natural for a person's social status or physical attractiveness. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval romance, the combination of religious oppression, social constraints, economic pressures, medical ignorance, legal inequality, and superstitious terror created a perfect storm of relationship dysfunction. Medieval dating wasn't just difficult or challenging. It was a systematic assault on human intimacy and connection. The very institutions that were supposed to support and protect relationships, the church, the legal system, the family structure, were designed in ways that made genuine love and partnership virtually impossible. When we look back at the medieval period, we often focus on the grand narratives of kings and battles, of cathedral building and crusades. But for the vast majority of people living through this era, the most fundamental human experience, the search for love and companionship, was corrupted by forces beyond their control. The medieval approach to romance created generations of people who were taught to fear their own desires, distrust their own feelings, and accept loveless relationships as normal and even virtuous. It's a sobering reminder of how social systems can shape and distort the most basic human experiences, and how far we've come in recognizing the fundamental right to love and be loved freely. And so, As we drift towards sleep in our modern world, we can be grateful that we live in an age where love is no longer seen as evidence of demonic possession, where romantic passion is not automatically suspect, and where the simple act of falling in love doesn't carry the risk of accusations of witchcraft. The night is quiet now. The medieval terrors have faded into history. Love has been freed from the chains of superstition, and we can rest peacefully, knowing that our deepest emotions are our own, natural and human, requiring no explanation beyond the simple truth that to love and be loved is perhaps the most beautiful aspect of being alive. The weight of evening settles around you now, heavy as the stone walls of a medieval fortress. You've journeyed with us through the elaborate theatre of medieval justice, witnessed the symbolic choreography of punishment, and glimpsed the supernatural fears that haunted romantic relationships in those distant centuries. Tonight, we delve deeper still into the shadows where punishment became not just spectacle, but a carefully orchestrated dance between earthly authority and divine will. Picture, if you will, a market square in 14th century England. The morning mist clings to cobblestones, still damp with dew, and already a crowd has begun to gather. Word has spread through the narrow streets that today there will be justice. Not the swift private justice of our modern world, but the slow, deliberate, utterly public justice of medieval times. For in that era, punishment was never a solitary affair. It required witnesses, participants, an entire community to transform individual transgression into collective moral instruction. The medieval mind saw punishment not as rehabilitation, but as restoration. When someone broke the law, they didn't simply harm their victim. They tore the fabric of society itself, disrupted the divine order that held the world together. The punishment, therefore, had to be equally cosmic in scope. It needed to repair not just the immediate damage, but the spiritual wound inflicted upon the community's soul. Consider the peculiar case of sanctuary, that ancient right which allowed even the most heinous criminal to claim protection within consecrated ground. A murderer could flee to the nearest church, grasp the altar, and for 40 days remain untouchable by secular law. This wasn't mercy in any sense we might recognize today. It was a recognition that justice belonged not to earthly courts alone, but to God himself. The criminal's fate would be decided through ordeal, through divine intervention, or through the slow starvation that awaited those who dared not leave their sanctuary. But sanctuary was merely one thread in the complex tapestry of medieval justice. The system was shot through with supernatural elements that transformed legal proceedings into something resembling religious ritual. Trial by ordeal, for instance, operated on the fundamental assumption that God would intervene directly in human affairs to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. Imagine being accused of theft in 12th century France. The evidence against you is circumstantial, witnesses unreliable, your guilt or innocence a matter of debate. In our world, lawyers would argue, evidence would be weighed, reasonable doubt might save you. But in medieval France, you would face the ordeal of hot iron. A piece of metal, blessed by priests and heated until it glowed like a fallen star, would be placed in your palm. You would carry it 9 paces, then have your hand bound and sealed. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed. If your burns showed signs of healing, God had proclaimed your innocence. If infection had set in, divine judgment had found you guilty. The ceremony surrounding such ordeals was elaborate, solemn, designed to emphasize that this was not mere superstition, but sacred truth. Priests would chant, incense would burn, the community would gather in hushed reverence as heaven itself was called upon to render verdict. The accused would fast for 3 days beforehand, attend Mass, receive communion, swear before God and assembled witnesses that they spoke truth. Every element reinforced the central premise that human justice was inadequate, that only divine intervention could pierce the veil of mortal deception. Yet even as they invoked God's judgment, medieval authorities were acutely aware of the social and political dimensions of punishment. Take the practice of trial by combat, which allowed accused nobles to defend their honor through armed conflict. This wasn't simply barbarism dressed up as justice. It was a sophisticated recognition that among the warrior class, reputation and physical prowess were inextricably linked. A knight who could not defend himself in battle was unfit to hold land, command men, or participate in the feudal system that governed medieval society. The rules governing trial by combat were intricate, almost liturgical in their precision. Weapons had to be identical, the field blessed, prayers offered, witnesses sworn. When a knight stepped into the lists to defend his honor, he wasn't just fighting for his life. He was participating in a sacred drama that reaffirmed the divine right of the strong to rule over the weak, the just to triumph over the corrupt. But what of those who lack the strength to fight, the skill to bear arms? Medieval law, with its characteristic attention to hierarchy and status, provided alternatives. A woman might choose a champion to fight on her behalf. A cleric could nominate a proxy. Even peasants, though excluded from trial by combat's noble prerogatives, had their own versions of divine judgment. They might plunge their arms into boiling water to retrieve a blessed stone, or be bound and thrown into consecrated pools where sinking proved innocence and floating proclaimed guilt. These practices seem barbarous to modern eyes, yet they served profound social functions in their time. They transformed individual crimes into community events, private grievances into public moral instruction. They reinforced religious authority by demonstrating God's active involvement in human affairs. Most importantly, they provided a mechanism for resolving disputes in a world where secular law was often weak, inconsistent, or non-existent. The medieval obsession with public punishment extended far beyond trials and ordeals. Execution itself was theatre, carefully choreographed to extract maximum moral impact from the condemned person's final moments. The scaffold was positioned to provide optimal viewing for the largest possible audience. The route from prison to execution ground was deliberately circuitous, allowing crowds to gather, victims to be displayed, final speeches to be delivered. But execution was not the only fate awaiting the condemned. Medieval creativity in matters of punishment was legendary, producing a catalogue of torments that reflected both the era's theological preoccupations and its practical understanding of human psychology. Public humiliation, for instance, was considered punishment enough for many minor offences. The stocks and pillory transformed the town square into a stage where social order was daily reaffirmed through the ritual degradation of those who challenged it. The convicted criminal, head and hands locked in wooden frames, became a living monument to the consequences of transgression. But this wasn't simple cruelty. The community that gathered to mock and torment the prisoner was also participating in a collective affirmation of shared values. Every rotten egg thrown, every taunt shouted, every laugh at the prisoner's expense reinforced the social bonds that held medieval society together. More serious crimes demanded more elaborate responses. Branding marked the criminal's body permanently, ensuring that their transgression would follow them wherever they went. But the symbols burned into flesh weren't arbitrary. They were carefully chosen to reflect both the nature of the crime and the theological framework within which medieval society understood sin and redemption. A thief might bear the letter T upon their forehead, a heretic the cross that mocked their betrayal of faith. The process of branding was itself ritualized, surrounded by religious symbolism that emphasized the spiritual dimensions of earthly justice. The iron would be blessed, prayers offered, the crowd reminded that they witnessed not mere human vengeance, but divine judgment made manifest in flesh and fire. Yet perhaps no aspect of medieval punishment reveals the era's distinctive worldview more clearly than its treatment of the body after death. Execution was often just the beginning of the condemned person's journey through the justice system. Their corpse might be displayed for days or weeks, a rotting reminder of the wages of sin. It might be dismembered, the pieces distributed to different locations as both warning and trophy. Or it might be subjected to the ultimate medieval humiliation, denial of proper burial. In a world where salvation depended upon the proper treatment of mortal remains, where resurrection was literal truth and the body's integrity essential to eternal life, refusing burial was tantamount to damning the soul itself. This wasn't simply practical deterrence. It was theological warfare, the deliberate deployment of religious terror in service of earthly order. The criminal's family, meanwhile, found themselves caught in a web of shame and association that could persist for generations. Medieval society believed firmly in inherited guilt, the notion that sin polluted bloodlines as surely as disease corrupted flesh. The children of traitors faced legal disabilities, social ostracism, economic hardship that might never end. The wife of a heretic might find herself suspected of sharing his beliefs, her own faith called into question by marriage alone. This system of collective responsibility served multiple functions. It provided powerful incentives for families to police their own members' behavior. It reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating the consequences of challenging established authority. And it satisfied the medieval craving for comprehensive justice, punishment that addressed not just individual guilt, but the broader social disruption that crime represented. Yet even as medieval authorities deployed these elaborate mechanisms of social control, they remained acutely aware of their own limitations. Human justice, however carefully constructed, however divinely sanctioned, remained fallible. Kings might err, judges might be corrupted, witnesses might lie. The medieval solution was characteristically theological. Appeal to higher authority. The right of appeal to royal justice, to ecclesiastical courts, to the Pope himself, provided multiple layers of review that reflected medieval society's hierarchical understanding of authority and truth. Each level of appeal brought different perspectives, different priorities, different interpretations of law and custom. A case that seemed clear-cut in local court might appear more complex when viewed from the royal palace, more nuanced still when examined through the lens of canon law. This wasn't simply legal procedure, it was metaphysical architecture, a system designed to ensure that earthly justice aligned as closely as possible with divine will. The multiple courts, the elaborate appeals process, the careful attention to precedent and custom, all serve to filter human judgment through increasingly refined spiritual and intellectual frameworks. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval justice retained a persistent awareness of its own provisional nature. Unlike modern legal systems that claim finality, medieval courts understood themselves as temporary arbiters of eternal truths. Their verdicts, however solemnly pronounced, however elaborately enforced, remained subject to review by higher authorities, earthly kings, heavenly judges, and ultimately God himself. This theological humility manifested in curious ways throughout the medieval justice system. Pardons were common, reflecting the Christian emphasis on mercy and redemption. Royal prerogative allowed monarchs to commute sentences, reverse verdicts, grant clemency in cases where earthly justice seemed inadequate. The Church offered sanctuary, intercession, alternative courts where different principles might prevail. Even execution itself was surrounded by opportunities for divine intervention. Last-minute reprieves were not uncommon, sometimes attributed to royal mercy, sometimes to miraculous intervention. The condemned person's final moments were carefully managed to allow for confession, absolution, the possibility that genuine repentance might yet secure salvation despite earthly punishment. As you drift towards sleep now, consider the profound difference between medieval and modern approaches to justice. Where we seek efficiency, they sought meaning. Where we pursue deterrence, they craved restoration. Where we separate secular and sacred law, they understood all justice as fundamentally divine. Their punishments may seem cruel to modern eyes, but they emerged from a worldview that took human dignity seriously enough to believe that individual choices mattered not just to society, but to the cosmos itself. The medieval criminal, suffering in stocks or burning at the stake, was participating in a drama far larger than personal consequence. Their punishment served to reaffirm divine order, reinforce social bonds, demonstrate the ultimate accountability of human action to eternal judgment. In a world where earthly life was brief and eternity stretched endlessly ahead, such concerns seemed not cruel but essential. Tomorrow we'll explore how these same impulses shaped medieval society's understanding of sin, redemption, and the delicate relationship between human authority and divine will. But for now, let the weight of history settle around you like a familiar blanket. Sleep well, knowing that justice, however imperfect, however slowly, continues its ancient work of binding human communities together in shared recognition of right and wrong. As we've journeyed through the brutal landscape of medieval justice, we've seen how punishment was theatre, how execution was entertainment, and how the human body became a canvas for displaying divine and earthly authority. But now, we must descend even deeper into this world of sanctified cruelty, where the very concept of mercy was twisted into something unrecognizable, and where the Church's influence transformed justice into a grotesque performance of moral superiority. Picture this: a cold morning in 14th century France. The cathedral bells ring not for prayer, but for punishment. A crowd gathers in the town square, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, vendors selling meat pies and ale, everyone chattering excitedly as if waiting for a travelling minstrel show. But today's entertainment is different. Today they're here to watch a woman burn. Her crime: she was caught with an herbal remedy that eased childbirth pain. In our modern world, she'd be a midwife, perhaps even a doctor. But in medieval times, any woman who possessed knowledge of healing, especially knowledge that seemed to defy God's will that women should suffer in childbirth, was immediately suspect. The Church taught that labour pain was Eve's punishment for original sin, and any attempt to ease that suffering was tantamount to defying God himself. This wasn't justice, as we understand it today. This was something far more sinister: the weaponization of faith, the transformation of religious doctrine into a tool of social control that made modern authoritarian regimes look positively restrained. At least today's dictators generally don't claim that their torture chambers are blessed by the Almighty. The medieval Church didn't just influence justice, it consumed it entirely. Every court, every judgment, every punishment was filtered through a religious lens that transformed earthly law into cosmic theatre. Judges weren't just deciding guilt or innocence. They were supposedly channeling divine will, making every sentence a religious decree and every execution a holy act. Consider the elaborate ritual surrounding heresy trials. These weren't simple legal proceedings, but carefully choreographed performances designed to demonstrate the Church's absolute authority over human souls. The accused would be brought before a tribunal of priests and scholars, men who claimed to speak for God himself. The trial would begin with prayers, continue with theological debates that the accused couldn't possibly understand, and end with a sentence that was presented as divinely inspired. But here's what made medieval heresy trials particularly insidious. They were designed to be unwinnable. The accused faced a catch-22 that would make modern prosecutors weep with envy. Confess to heresy, and you'd be burned alive for corrupting others. Refuse to confess, and you'd be burned alive for being obstinate in your error. Claim you were never a heretic in the first place, and you'd be burned alive for lying to holy men. The only way to avoid immediate execution was to confess, repent, and provide the names of other heretics. This created a self-perpetuating machine of accusation and terror that could theoretically run forever, fed by the desperate testimony of people who would say anything to delay their own deaths by even a few weeks. Compare this to our modern legal system with all its flaws. Today, we have the presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, rules of evidence, and appeals processes. A defendant today faces a system that, while imperfect, at least pretends to be fair. Medieval heretics faced a system that openly proclaimed fairness was irrelevant because God's will was already known. The medieval obsession with public punishment reached its pinnacle in the treatment of those convicted of witchcraft. These executions weren't just about eliminating supposed threats. They were elaborate religious ceremonies designed to purify the entire community through the ritualistic destruction of evil. The condemned witch would be paraded through town, often naked or in a white shift that symbolized the purity she had corrupted. Priests would walk alongside, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water to cleanse the very ground she touched. The crowd would throw stones, rotten food, and excrement, participating in what they genuinely believed was a holy act of communal purification. At the burning site, more rituals awaited. The pyre would be blessed by priests, holy relics would be displayed, and prayers would be offered for the witch's soul even as her body was prepared for destruction. Sometimes, in a gesture of mercy, the executioner would strangle the victim before lighting the fire, though this mercy was often reserved for those who confessed and repented. But here's what's truly chilling about these witch burnings. They were often genuinely popular events. People didn't just attend out of morbid curiosity or social pressure. Many truly believed they were witnessing the triumph of good over evil, the purification of their community, the demonstration of God's justice on earth. Children would be brought to watch so they could learn what happened to those who strayed from righteousness. This wasn't mindless mob violence. It was organized, sanctified, institutionalized cruelty carried out with the full authority of the church and the enthusiastic support of the community. It was evil with a moral justification, brutality dressed up as righteousness. Modern authoritarian regimes certainly commit horrific acts, but they rarely manage to convince their entire populations that torture and murder are not just necessary, but morally praiseworthy. Medieval Europe achieved this through the genius of combining religious authority with legal power, creating a system where questioning the justice of burning people alive was itself a form of heresy. The Church's influence on medieval punishment went beyond individual cases to shape the very concept of justice itself. The idea of proportional punishment, that the penalty should fit the crime, was largely abandoned in favor of symbolic punishment designed to demonstrate theological principles. Take the crime of blasphemy. In our modern secular world, blasphemy might get you criticized on social media or, in some countries, a fine or brief imprisonment. In medieval Europe, blasphemy was treated as a form of treason against God himself, punishable by having your tongue cut out, your lips sewn shut, or your entire head encased in an iron mask designed to prevent you from ever speaking again. The logic was theological rather than practical. The punishment wasn't meant to deter future blasphemy, though it certainly did that, but to symbolically restore the cosmic order that had been disrupted by the blasphemer's words. Your tongue was cut out, not because society needed to be protected from your speech, but because your tongue had committed a sin against God and therefore deserved to be destroyed. This theological approach to justice created punishments that seem almost incomprehensibly cruel to modern minds. A thief who stole from a church might have his hands cut off, then be forced to wear them around his neck as he was paraded through town, and finally be buried alive with the severed hands placed on his chest. The punishment wasn't just about stopping theft. It was about demonstrating that crimes against the church were crimes against God himself, requiring not just physical punishment but spiritual humiliation. Even the timing of executions was carefully orchestrated for maximum religious impact. Public burnings were often scheduled for religious holidays, transforming holy days into spectacles of divine justice. Christmas, Easter, and feast days of saints became occasions for demonstrating God's wrath against sinners. The condemned would be forced to participate in their own religious humiliation. Before execution, they would be required to confess their sins publicly, not just to save their souls, but to validate the entire system that was killing them. They had to acknowledge that their punishment was just, that their deaths were necessary, that the church's authority was absolute. Those who refused to confess faced additional tortures designed to break their will. They might be stretched on the rack, have their bones crushed, or be subjected to the infamous peine forte et dure, being slowly pressed to death under heavy stones. The torture would continue until they either confessed or died, and if they died without confessing, their property would be confiscated and their families left destitute. This created a psychological horror that went far beyond physical pain. The condemned faced not just death, but the knowledge that their refusal to confess would destroy their families' futures. Many people undoubtedly confessed to crimes they hadn't committed, simply to ensure their children wouldn't starve. The church's genius lay in making resistance seem not just futile, but actively harmful to everyone you loved. It was emotional blackmail, elevated to the level of divine commandment, psychological torture, sanctified by religious authority. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval religious justice was how it corrupted the very concept of mercy. In our modern understanding, mercy means showing compassion, reducing punishment, offering second chances. In medieval Europe, mercy often meant being allowed to confess your sins before being executed, or being strangled before being burned, or having your death delayed long enough for a priest to absolve you. The Church taught that showing too much earthly mercy was actually cruel to the sinner's soul. Better to execute a heretic quickly than to let them live and corrupt others, dooming even more souls to eternal damnation. This inverted logic turned brutality into compassion and mercy into sin. Judges and executioners genuinely believed they were performing acts of Christian charity when they tortured confessions out of accused witches. They weren't just protecting society, they were saving souls from eternal torment. The screams of the tortured were reframed as the sounds of demons being expelled, the tears of the condemned as evidence of spiritual purification. This wasn't cynical manipulation by corrupt officials, though that certainly existed too. This was the entire society that had convinced itself that cruelty was kindness, that torture was therapy, that murder was mercy. It was evil so complete it had forgotten it was evil. Compare this to our modern struggles with justice. Yes, we still debate the death penalty, prison reform, and police brutality. Yes, our system is far from perfect. But at least we recognize these as problems to be solved, rather than divine commands to be obeyed. We don't claim that police brutality is blessed by God, or that mass incarceration is a form of spiritual healing. The medieval church's transformation of justice into religious theatre had consequences that lasted far beyond the Middle Ages. It established the principle that authority could justify any act, no matter how cruel, by claiming divine sanction. It normalized the idea that some people deserve not just punishment, but complete dehumanization. It created a template for organized evil that would be used again and again throughout history. When Spanish conquistadors enslaved and murdered millions of indigenous Americans, they did so with the blessing of the Church, using the same theological justifications that had been used to burn witches in Europe. When the Inquisition spread its tentacles across Catholic Europe, it employed the same techniques of confession, torture, and execution that had been perfected in medieval heresy trials. Even secular totalitarian regimes of the 20th century borrowed extensively from the medieval playbook. The show trials, the forced confessions, the public executions, the transformation of individual punishment into community ritual. Stalin's purges and Hitler's rallies were medieval theatre updated for modern audiences. The medieval church didn't just influence justice. It created a template for how power could use moral authority to justify absolute cruelty. It showed how ordinary people could be convinced to participate enthusiastically in the most horrific acts if those acts were presented as righteous, necessary, and divinely commanded. And perhaps most chillingly, it demonstrated that evil doesn't need to hide in shadows or operate in secret. Given the right combination of religious authority, social pressure, and moral justification, evil can operate in broad daylight with the full support of the community while genuinely believing itself to be good. The crowds that gathered to watch burnings weren't monsters. They were ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, mothers, children, who had been convinced that watching a fellow human being burn alive was not just acceptable, but morally praiseworthy. They went home after the execution feeling virtuous, believing they had participated in God's work, secure in the knowledge that their community was now a little more pure, a little more holy. That perhaps is the most terrifying legacy of medieval justice, not just the individual acts of cruelty, but the demonstration that entire societies can be convinced to embrace evil while believing themselves to be good. It's a lesson that remains horrifyingly relevant today as we watch modern societies struggle with the same tendency to transform fear and hatred into moral imperatives. The medieval world may be gone, but its ghosts still haunt us. Every time authority claims divine sanction for cruelty, every time a community unites around the destruction of the other, every time mercy is reframed as weakness and brutality as virtue, we hear the echo of those medieval bells calling the faithful to witness another demonstration of God's justice. The only difference is that now, hopefully, some of us have learned to recognize the sound for what it really is, not the voice of God, but the ancient song of human evil, dressed up in holy robes and singing in sacred spaces, but evil nonetheless. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of medieval punishment was how it transformed human suffering into sacred theatre, where pain became performance and agony became a lesson written in blood and bone. The execution ground was not merely a place of death, it was a stage where the cosmic order reasserted itself, where divine justice manifested through human instruments, and where entire communities gathered to witness the restoration of moral balance. These spectacles were carefully choreographed affairs, planned with the precision of religious ceremonies because that's precisely what they were. The condemned would be paraded through the streets in a procession that mirrored Christ's walk to Calvary, their suffering deliberately echoing the Passion narrative. Crowds would line the route, not merely as voyeurs but as participants in a sacred drama where their presence validated the righteousness of the proceedings. The timing of executions was never random. They coincided with market days when the maximum number of witnesses could gather, or with religious festivals when the moral message would resonate most powerfully. The scaffold was positioned to be visible from great distances, often erected in town squares or elevated ground, where geography itself amplified the spectacle's reach. Consider the execution of a heretic in 14th century Toulouse. The ceremony began at dawn with the ringing of church bells, their pealing announcing not just death, but divine vindication. The condemned, already weakened by months of imprisonment and interrogation, would be dressed in a yellow robe painted with devils and flames, transforming them into a walking sermon about damnation. A pointed cap bearing the word heretic crowned their head, ensuring that even from a distance, spectators understood the nature of the crime. As the procession moved through the streets, Priests would chant prayers for the soul of the condemned while simultaneously denouncing their crimes. This dual message of mercy and condemnation reflected the complex theology underlying medieval punishment. The Church could offer forgiveness for the soul while still demanding the destruction of the body, a distinction that allowed for both Christian compassion and brutal justice. The crowd's participation was essential to the ritual's effectiveness. They were expected to pray for the condemned soul while simultaneously celebrating their destruction. Vendors sold food and drink, turning the execution into a festival atmosphere where spiritual edification merged with community entertainment. Children were brought to witness these events, their education in moral order, beginning with images of what befell those who challenged divine authority. When the procession reached the execution ground, the theatre intensified. The condemned would be given one final opportunity to confess their sins and beg forgiveness, not because this might save their life, but because public repentance validated the justice of their fate. Those who maintained their innocence or refused to acknowledge their crimes were seen as doubly damned, their stubbornness proof of their corruption. The method of execution itself was chosen for maximum symbolic impact. Heretics burned because fire purified, and because their fate echoed the eternal flames awaiting them. Traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered because the dismemberment of their bodies reflected the fragmentation they had brought to the social order. Witches drowned because water was God's instrument of judgment, separating the innocent from the guilty as surely as it had in Noah's flood. But the spectacle didn't end with death. The disposal of the body carried its own symbolic weight. Some corpses were left hanging as warnings, their decay serving as a continuing sermon about the wages of sin. Others were buried in unconsecrated ground, denying them the comfort of Christian burial and the hope of resurrection. The most heinous criminals might have their bodies scattered to prevent any possibility of martyrdom or veneration. These punishments were designed to resonate far beyond the moment of death. They created what we might call a theology of terror, where the memory of suffering served as a constant reminder of divine power. Stories of executions spread through oral tradition, growing more elaborate and frightening with each telling. The screams of the condemned echoed in community memory long after their voices had been silenced. The symbolic language of medieval punishment was remarkably sophisticated. Every element of the ritual carried meaning that the audience was expected to decode. The yellow robes of heretics represented their spiritual corruption. The blindfolds worn by some condemned criminals symbolized their moral blindness. Even the wood used for burning carried significance, with different types chosen for their symbolic properties rather than their burning characteristics. This theatrical approach to punishment reflected a worldview where the physical and spiritual realms were intimately connected. The suffering of the body was believed to have direct consequences for the soul, and the public nature of punishment ensured that the entire community participated in the spiritual cleansing that execution was thought to provide. It wasn't enough for justice to be done. It had to be seen, understood, and internalized by every witness. The psychological impact of these spectacles on medieval communities cannot be overstated. They created a shared vocabulary of fear that shaped behavior long after the execution ground had been cleared. The knowledge that any deviation from accepted norms could result in public humiliation and agonizing death created a powerful incentive for conformity. But it also fostered a culture where cruelty was normalized, where the suffering of others became entertainment, and where compassion was often seen as weakness. Modern observers might wonder how entire communities could participate in such brutality, but medieval people understood these events within a religious framework that justified extreme measures in defense of cosmic order. They believed they were witnessing divine justice made manifest, participating in sacred ritual that protected their souls and their society from corruption. The pain of the condemned was not seen as senseless cruelty, but as necessary medicine for a diseased world. This transformation of punishment into theatre also served important political functions. It demonstrated the power of authority while providing a controlled outlet for social tensions. The crowd's bloodlust was channeled toward acceptable targets, reinforcing existing hierarchies while offering the illusion of participation in justice. Those who might otherwise direct their anger toward lords or kings could instead focus their rage on criminals and heretics. The legacy of these theatrical punishments extended far beyond the medieval period, shaping attitudes toward justice and authority that persisted for centuries. The idea that punishment should be public, that suffering should serve as education, and that the community should participate in the administration of justice all have their roots in medieval practice. Even today, our fascination with true crime and our debates about the death penalty echo the medieval belief that punishment should serve as moral instruction for society as a whole. Part 8. The Theatre of Medieval Justice. As you settle deeper into sleep, let the weight of your modern troubles drift away like morning mist. Tonight, we journey back to a time when justice wasn't delivered in sterile courtrooms, but performed as grand theatre, where punishment was spectacle, and where the line between divine judgment and earthly entertainment blurred into something both magnificent and terrifying. Picture, if you will, the cobblestone square of a medieval town on a crisp autumn morning. The air carries the scent of wood smoke and freshly baked bread, but underneath lurks something darker. Today is Judgment Day. Today, justice will be served not behind closed doors, but in full view of God, king, and commoner alike. The scaffold stands ready, draped in black cloth, while the crowd gathers like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Medieval justice was never a quiet affair. It was theatre in the truest sense, complete with elaborate costumes, ritualized speeches, and carefully choreographed performances designed to leave lasting impressions on both participants and audience. The condemned didn't simply face death, they faced transformation into living symbols, cautionary tales carved in flesh and bone. Consider the ritual of drawing and quartering, reserved for the most heinous crimes against crown and God. The condemned would be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, their body grinding against cobblestones as crowds hurled abuse and refuse. But this was merely the opening act. At the scaffold, they would be hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still breathing. What followed was a systematic dismantling of the human form, each cut deliberate, each removal ceremonial. The executioner wasn't merely a killer, but a master craftsman, his tools blessed by priests, his techniques passed down through generations like sacred knowledge. He would remove the entrails while the victim still lived, holding them aloft for the crowd to see, proclaiming the wages of sin made manifest. The quartering that followed wasn't random butchery, but ritualized division, the four limbs representing the four corners of the kingdom that had been betrayed. Compare this to our modern system, where execution happens in sterile chambers, witnessed by a handful of officials and journalists. Medieval justice demanded an audience. It required participation. The crowd wasn't merely watching, they were part of the sacrament, their gasps and prayers and cheers essential to the ritual's power. Death became communion, punishment became purification, and the scaffold became an altar where society's sins were expiated through carefully orchestrated suffering. But the theatre extended far beyond execution. Consider the elaborate ceremonies surrounding trials by ordeal, where divine judgment was sought through physical testing. The accused might plunge their hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone, with healing determining innocence. Or they might be bound and cast into blessed water, sinking proving purity while floating revealed guilt. These weren't crude tortures, but sacred dramas, complete with incantations, holy relics, and priestly benedictions. The ordeal of hot iron was particularly theatrical. The accused would fast for 3 days while priests prepared the metal in consecrated fires. On the appointed day, dressed in white robes like a sacrificial offering, they would grasp the glowing iron and carry it 9 paces while crowds held their breath. The hand would be bandaged and sealed, then examined 3 days later. Clear healing meant divine approval. Festering wounds proclaimed guilt louder than any human testimony. These rituals served multiple purposes beyond determining guilt or innocence. They reinforced social hierarchies, with elaborate protocols dictating who could demand ordeals, who could administer them, and who could witness them. They demonstrated the Church's power to channel divine will through earthly ceremonies. Most importantly, they transformed legal proceedings into religious experiences, making every trial a renewal of society's covenant with God. The symbolism embedded in medieval punishments was intricate and deliberate. Thieves might have their hands severed, the tools of their crime removed with ceremonial precision. Liars could have their tongues pierced or removed, silencing the organs of deception. Adulterers might be forced to wear distinctive clothing or subjected to public shaming rituals that transformed their bodies into walking sermons about moral purity. Public hangings became elaborate festivals, with vendors selling food and drink, musicians providing entertainment, and officials delivering lengthy speeches about justice and divine will. The condemned were expected to play their part, confessing sins, praising their judges, and expressing gratitude for the opportunity to meet their Maker with cleared consciences. Those who refused to perform properly might face additional torments, their suffering extended until they provided the moral clarity the audience demanded. The gibbet, where bodies were left to rot as warnings to others, represented the ultimate fusion of punishment and theatre. These weren't merely corpses, but continuing performances, their decay serving as ongoing sermons about the consequences of sin. Some were encased in iron cages that preserved their form while allowing decomposition to proceed, creating grotesque sculptures that spoke to passers-by for months or years. Medieval justice recognized no distinction between body and soul, between temporal and eternal punishment. Physical suffering was understood as spiritual purification, pain as pathway to redemption. The elaborate rituals surrounding execution weren't cruelty, but mercy, opportunities for the condemned to achieve salvation through properly performed repentance. Death became birth, punishment became blessing, and the scaffold became a gateway to paradise. This theatrical approach to justice served as social cement, binding communities together through shared witnessing of divine judgment. Everyone from nobles to peasants could attend executions, creating rare moments of social unity where hierarchical distinctions temporarily dissolved in the face of ultimate authority. The crowd became congregation, the execution became mass, and justice became sacrament. But the theatre wasn't reserved for the guilty alone. Medieval society celebrated the restoration of justice with elaborate pageantry. Pardons were granted with ceremonial flourish, often timed to coincide with religious festivals or royal celebrations. The forgiven would process through streets wearing white robes, their redemption performed as publicly as their condemnation had been. Justice wasn't simply done, it was seen, felt, and remembered. The contrast with modern justice couldn't be more stark. Where we seek efficiency and sterility, medieval society demanded spectacle and participation. Where we pursue rehabilitation and measured punishment, they sought purification and divine judgment. Where we separate legal proceedings from religious observance, they fused law and theology into unified performances of cosmic significance. Yet perhaps there's something we've lost in our clinical approach to justice. Medieval punishments for all their brutality, carried meaning that resonated through society. They weren't merely deterrents, but communal rituals that reinforced shared values and collective identity. The theatre of justice served as ongoing education, moral instruction delivered through dramatic performance that engaged emotions as well as intellect. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding medieval justice reflected a worldview where every action carried cosmic significance, where earthly punishment mirrored divine judgment, and where society's health depended on the proper performance of moral drama. These weren't primitive attempts at law enforcement, but sophisticated rituals designed to maintain the delicate balance between order and chaos, justice and mercy, human will and divine authority. As we drift deeper into sleep, let us remember that even in their harshness, these medieval rituals served essential human needs for meaning, community, and connection to forces greater than ourselves. The theatre of justice may have been cruel, but it was never meaningless. Every execution was a passion play, every trial a morality tale, every punishment a sermon carved in flesh and delivered through carefully orchestrated suffering. In the morning, we wake to a world where justice is swift, clean, and largely invisible. But in our dreams, we can still hear the crowds gathering in the square, still see the elaborate ceremonies that transformed punishment into performance, still feel the weight of a society where every judgment carried the force of divine will, and every execution became a moment of terrible, beautiful theatre. Sleep now, and let the distant sound of medieval bells remind you that even in the darkest chapters of human history, people sought meaning in suffering, community in shared witness, and redemption in the careful performance of justice as sacred drama. As dawn broke across medieval Europe, casting long shadows through the narrow streets of countless towns and villages, the echoes of the previous night's screams had barely faded from memory. But this wasn't simply about individual suffering or isolated acts of cruelty. What we've witnessed throughout our journey into medieval punishment reveals something far more systematic, far more deliberate. These weren't random acts of violence or occasional lapses in justice. They were the carefully orchestrated instruments of a society built on fear, control, and the absolute necessity of maintaining order through terror. The medieval world had transformed punishment into performance art, where every public execution, every branding, every moment in the stocks served multiple purposes beyond simple retribution. These spectacles were lessons written in blood and bone, textbooks of terror that taught entire populations exactly what happened when you stepped out of a line. When a thief's hand was severed in the town square, it wasn't just about punishing theft. It was about sending a message to every person watching, every child who might grow up thinking they could take what wasn't theirs, every desperate soul who might consider that loaf of bread worth the risk. The genius of medieval punishment lay not in its creativity, though it certainly had that in abundance, but in its psychological precision. The architects of these systems understood something fundamental about human nature, that the fear of punishment could be far more effective than punishment itself. A single public flaying could prevent 100 potential crimes. One witch burning could silence 1,000 dissenting voices. The spectacle of suffering became a form of social conditioning that shaped behavior across entire generations. Consider how these punishments were designed to linger in memory long after the physical act was complete. The branding iron that marked a criminal's forehead ensured their shame would follow them forever. A walking advertisement of their transgression that made redemption nearly impossible. The scarlet letter of medieval times wasn't cloth sewn onto clothing, but flesh seared with hot metal, bone broken in specific patterns, scars carved into skin that would serve as permanent reminders of the price of defiance. But perhaps most insidiously, these punishments created a culture where people policed themselves and each other with ruthless efficiency. When your neighbour could be accused of witchcraft for brewing herbs, when your friend could face execution for speaking against the Lord, When your own family members might testify against you to save themselves, trust became a luxury few could afford. The medieval punishment system created a society of informants, where survival often depended on being the first to point the finger at someone else. The religious authorities understood this dynamic perfectly, weaving divine judgment into every aspect of the punishment process. When a criminal was tortured, it wasn't just the state asserting its power. It was God himself working through earthly instruments to purge sin from the community. When someone survived an ordeal by fire or water, it wasn't luck or constitution. It was divine intervention, proving their innocence. This fusion of earthly and heavenly authority made resistance not just illegal, but literally heretical. The economic dimensions of medieval punishment reveal another layer of systematic control. Fines and confiscations didn't just punish individuals, they enriched those in power while impoverishing potential troublemakers. A merchant who challenged local authority might find himself bankrupted by legal fees and penalties, ensuring he could never again pose a threat to the established order. A peasant who complained about working conditions might lose his land, his tools, his very means of survival. The punishment became self-perpetuating, creating a class of people so desperate they had no choice but absolute compliance. These systems were particularly effective because they operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The physical punishment satisfied the crowd's desire for justice and spectacle. The religious component provided moral justification and divine sanction. The economic aspect enriched the ruling class while impoverishing potential opponents. And the psychological warfare kept entire populations in a state of constant anxiety, never quite sure when they might cross an invisible line and find themselves on the wrong end of the executioner's blade. The medieval understanding of justice was fundamentally different from our modern conception. Today, we speak of punishment as rehabilitation, as giving criminals a chance to reform and reintegrate into society. Medieval punishment was about elimination, about removing problematic elements from the community either through death, permanent disfigurement, or exile. There was no expectation that a criminal would learn from their mistakes and become a productive citizen. They were broken things to be discarded, examples to be made, warnings carved in flesh. This approach created a society where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for survival. Innovation was dangerous because it meant doing things differently from tradition. Questions were risky because they implied doubt about established authority. Even success could be threatening if it made you stand out too much from your peers. The nail that stuck up got hammered down, often literally. The documentation that survives from medieval courts reveals the bureaucratic precision with which these horrors were administered. Detailed records were kept of every fine collected, every limb severed, every life extinguished. These weren't crimes of passion or moments of temporary madness. They were carefully planned, meticulously executed, and thoroughly documented administrative procedures. The banality of evil, as one scholar would later call it, was perfected in the medieval courthouse. But perhaps most chilling of all was how these systems trained entire populations to view suffering as entertainment. Public executions weren't grim necessities that people attended reluctantly. They were festivals, celebrations, social gatherings where families brought picnic lunches, and children played games while someone was slowly tortured to death mere feet away. The normalization of brutality reached levels that seem almost incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The psychological impact of growing up in such a society cannot be overstated. Children learned from their earliest years that authority was absolute, that questioning was dangerous, that pain and death were always lurking just beyond the boundaries of acceptable behavior. They internalized fear so completely that many never even considered the possibility of resistance. The medieval punishment system didn't just control bodies, It shaped minds, creating generations of people who couldn't imagine any alternative to the world they knew. The technological innovations in torture and execution that emerged during this period reveal a society that had dedicated considerable intellectual resources to the science of suffering. The rack, the iron maiden, the breaking wheel. These weren't crude instruments hastily assembled in moments of anger. They were sophisticated machines, carefully engineered to maximize pain while prolonging life, to extract confessions while breaking spirits. The same ingenuity that built cathedrals and developed new farming techniques was applied to the systematic destruction of human beings. The legal frameworks that supported these punishments were equally sophisticated, creating elaborate categories of crimes and corresponding penalties that left little room for judicial discretion or mercy. Every possible transgression had been anticipated, catalogued, and assigned its appropriate level of agony. The law became a vast menu of suffering, where judges could select the exact combination of pain and humiliation that best fit the offence and the offender's social status. Women, as we've seen throughout this series, faced particular horrors within this system. Accused of witchcraft for knowledge of herbs, condemned for adultery while their male partners went unpunished, tortured for refusing to confess to crimes they hadn't committed, they became the primary targets of a system that saw female independence as inherently threatening. The medieval punishment apparatus was, among other things, a vast machine for enforcing gender conformity through terror. The international nature of these practices reveals how thoroughly they had penetrated European consciousness. From Scotland to Sicily, from Portugal to Poland, the same basic principles applied. Authority must be absolute, dissent must be crushed, and examples must be made. The specific methods might vary slightly from region to region, but the underlying logic remained constant. Pain was power, fear was control, and public suffering was the most effective form of mass communication available. As we approach the end of our journey through this landscape of medieval horror, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. These weren't the products of a more primitive or less enlightened age. They were the logical extensions of systems designed to concentrate power in the hands of the few, while keeping the many in a state of perpetual submission. The methods were medieval, but the motivations were timelessly human. The desire to control, to dominate, to ensure that those in power remained in power regardless of the cost in human suffering. The legacy of medieval punishment extends far beyond the Middle Ages themselves. The psychological techniques, the fusion of religious and secular authority, the use of spectacle to enforce conformity, these tools of control have been refined and adapted by every authoritarian system since. Understanding how they worked, how they shaped entire societies, how they convinced ordinary people to participate in extraordinary cruelty, remains essential for recognizing when similar patterns emerge in our own time. Tomorrow, in our final installment, we'll explore how these medieval systems of punishment finally began to crumble, what forces eventually challenged their dominance, and what lessons their eventual downfall might offer for those who would build more just and humane societies. But for tonight, let the weight of what we've learned settle into your consciousness. Let the echoes of medieval screams remind you how precious and fragile our modern concepts of human rights and dignity truly are. And let the darkness of those distant centuries make you grateful for the light we've managed to kindle since then. However dim and flickering it might sometimes seem, the medieval world believed that order could only be maintained through terror, that peace could only be achieved through violence, that justice could only be served through suffering. They were wrong, but it took centuries of struggle and countless lives to prove it. Rest well, knowing that the long night of medieval punishment has finally ended, and that dawn, however slowly, has finally come. And so we arrive at the final truth about medieval justice. that it was never truly about justice at all. It was about power, wrapped in the language of divine will and cosmic order. The elaborate rituals of execution, the theatrical displays of torture, the carefully choreographed ceremonies of punishment, all of it served a single purpose: to remind every person in that rigid hierarchy exactly where they stood and what would happen if they dared to move. The medieval mind had created a perfect machine of control, one that operated on every level of human experience. Physical pain, yes, but also spiritual terror, social humiliation alongside legal condemnation, the threat of eternal damnation coupled with the promise of earthly suffering. Every punishment was designed to break not just the body, but the will to resist. Consider how completely this system had infiltrated daily life. A peasant couldn't look too long at a lord's wife without risking accusations of lustful thoughts. A merchant couldn't charge too much for grain without facing claims of usury and greed. A woman couldn't speak too boldly without inviting whispers of pride and rebellion. Every action, every word, every expression was monitored, judged, weighed against an impossible standard of submission. The church had achieved something remarkable and terrible. They had made people police themselves. Citizens informed on neighbours, children reported parents, spouses betrayed each other, all in service of maintaining the divine order. The fear of punishment had become so deeply embedded that most people never needed to be punished at all. They lived in constant voluntary submission to a system that demanded their degradation. This wasn't accidental. The elaborate nature of medieval punishments, their public character, their symbolic weight, all of this was carefully designed to create what we might now recognize as a form of mass psychological conditioning. The message was always the same: resistance is futile, suffering is deserved, and the established order reflects God's will. Think about the genius of it. By claiming divine authority, by wrapping every cruelty in religious justification, the medieval ruling class had created a system of oppression that victims were required to accept as moral. To resist wasn't just illegal, it was sinful. To question wasn't just dangerous, it was blasphemous. They had made rebellion into a crime against God Himself. The punishments we've explored, the breaking wheels, the iron maidens, the public burnings, these weren't aberrations or excesses of a cruel age. They were the logical culmination of a worldview that saw human suffering as both necessary and sacred. Pain was purification. Humiliation was justice. Death was mercy. Even the condemned were expected to participate in their own destruction. They were required to confess, to repent, to thank their executioners, to praise the very system that was killing them. The ideal medieval execution wasn't just the destruction of a criminal, it was the voluntary collaboration of the victim in their own annihilation. And perhaps most chillingly, this system worked. For centuries, it maintained social order through the simple expedient of making resistance seem impossible. People accepted their lot not because they were naturally submissive, but because they had been systematically conditioned to believe that any other arrangement was literally unthinkable. The medieval world created subjects who were grateful for their chains, who saw their oppression as salvation, who thanked their tormentors for the privilege of suffering. It was a masterpiece of social control, a testament to humanity's capacity for both cruelty and self-deception. But here's what the architects of this system never anticipated: that their perfect machine of control contained the seeds of its own destruction. By making every punishment a public spectacle, they inadvertently created opportunities for people to witness suffering and begin to question its necessity. By claiming divine authority for their cruelty, they invited comparisons with the actual teachings of mercy and compassion they claimed to represent. The very excess of medieval punishment, its theatrical brutality, its obvious disproportion, its casual cruelty toward the helpless, eventually began to revolt the very people it was designed to control. Slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, observers began to ask dangerous questions. Is this really what God wants? Is this truly justice? Is there perhaps another way? These questions, whispered at first, then spoken, then finally shouted, would eventually bring down the entire edifice of medieval justice. The system's greatest strength, its claim to divine mandate, became its fatal weakness when people began to suspect that their God might actually be disgusted by what was being done in his name. The end came not through revolution or conquest, but through a gradual erosion of belief. People simply stopped accepting that cruelty was sacred, that suffering was necessary, that the established order reflected divine will. The psychological conditioning that had held the system together for centuries began to crack, and once it started, the collapse was inevitable. Today we look back on medieval punishments with horror and disbelief. How could people have been so cruel? How could they have accepted such barbarity? How could they have convinced themselves that torture and execution were acts of love and mercy? But perhaps the better question is this: what systems of control and conditioning operate in our own time? What cruelties do we accept as necessary? What suffering do we justify as deserved? What forms of oppression have we learned to see as natural, inevitable, even sacred? The medieval world believed that their system of punishment reflected eternal, unchanging truth. They could no more imagine a world without public executions than we can imagine a world without. Well, perhaps that's for each of us to consider. The machine of medieval justice has been dismantled, its gears scattered, its operators forgotten. But the human capacity for creating such machines, for building systems that transform cruelty into virtue, that make oppression seem like salvation, that capacity remains. The medieval world ended, but the medieval mind endures, waiting always for the right conditions to rebuild its terrible instruments of control. And so we close our exploration of medieval punishments, not with relief that such dark times are behind us, but with vigilance. For the greatest lesson of that brutal age is not that people once were cruel, but that ordinary people, under the right conditions, can be convinced that any cruelty is justified. The medieval world didn't create monsters, it created a system that made monsters seem necessary. The executioners have long since turned to dust. The scaffolds have rotted away. The instruments of torture rust in museums, curiosities from a darker time. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of human nature, the machinery of control waits to be rebuilt. And the price of preventing that reconstruction is eternal vigilance against the seductive whisper that tells us our cruelty is virtue, our oppression is order, and our violence is love. As we draw this dark journey through medieval justice to a close, it's worth reflecting on just how far we've traveled as a civilization, yet how some shadows of these ancient practices still linger in unexpected places. The medieval world's approach to punishment was a masterclass in psychological manipulation wrapped in religious righteousness, and understanding it helps us recognize similar patterns in our modern world. Think about it for a moment. Medieval justice wasn't really about justice at all. It was about creating a society so terrified of stepping out of line that rebellion became unthinkable. Every public execution, every pillory session, every branding was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to remind everyone exactly where they stood in the social hierarchy. The message was clear. This is what happens when you forget your place. What's particularly chilling is how effectively this system worked. For centuries, people accepted the most horrific punishments as not just necessary, but morally righteous. They genuinely believed that watching someone being drawn and quartered was a form of spiritual education, that participating in the humiliation of a neighbor in the stocks was their Christian duty. The system didn't just control bodies, it controlled minds, hearts, and souls. Today's justice system, for all its flaws, operates on fundamentally different principles. We've largely abandoned the idea that punishment should be a public spectacle designed to terrorize the masses. Instead, we've embraced concepts like rehabilitation, proportionality, and human dignity. Our prisons, while far from perfect, are at least theoretically designed to reform rather than simply torture. We've recognized that crime often stems from social problems like poverty, mental illness, and lack of opportunity, rather than inherent moral corruption requiring divine retribution. The transformation is remarkable when you consider the specifics. Where medieval justice demanded that thieves lose their hands, modern justice might mandate community service and restitution. Where medieval courts burned heretics alive, modern courts protect freedom of speech and religion. Where medieval law prescribed death for adultery, modern law treats it as a private matter. We've moved from punishment as entertainment to punishment as rehabilitation, from public spectacle to private reflection. Yet we must remain vigilant, because the human impulses that drove medieval justice haven't disappeared. They've simply evolved and adapted to new circumstances. We still see elements of that old theatrical cruelty in various forms today. Public shaming through social media can destroy lives just as effectively as a medieval pillory. Political prisoners in authoritarian regimes face torture and execution that would be familiar to medieval victims. Even in democratic societies, we sometimes witness disturbing enthusiasm for harsh punishments, particularly when dealing with crimes that trigger our deepest fears and prejudices. The death penalty, still practiced in many places, carries echoes of medieval spectacle, though we've sanitized it with clinical procedures and limited audiences. Three strikes laws that impose life sentences for relatively minor offences reflect the same kind of disproportionate punishment that characterized medieval justice. Mass incarceration systems that destroy families and communities serve some of the same social control functions as medieval public punishments. Perhaps most importantly, we must recognize that the medieval system's greatest success wasn't in deterring crime, but in convincing people that extreme cruelty was not only acceptable, but necessary. The real horror wasn't just the physical suffering inflicted on victims, but the spiritual corruption of entire societies that learned to find entertainment and moral satisfaction in that suffering. This is why studying medieval justice remains relevant today. It serves as a warning about how quickly societies can normalize brutality when it's presented as serving a higher purpose. Whether that purpose is divine will, social order, national security, or public safety, the underlying mechanism remains the same. Convince people that their cruel treatment of others is actually virtuous, and you can get them to participate in almost any atrocity. As we drift towards sleep tonight, let us reflect on this dark journey through medieval justice. The contrast between then and now reveals humanity's slow, painful evolution from spectacle to system, from divine theatre to earthly process. Where medieval courts wielded hammers and fire, today's justice wields paperwork and probation officers. Where crowds once gathered to witness public executions, we now debate prison reform in committee rooms. Yet the shadows of medieval thinking haven't entirely disappeared. We still struggle with the fundamental question that plagued our ancestors: should justice heal or harm? Medieval society chose harm, wrapping cruelty in divine purpose and community ritual. They believed pain purified souls, and fear maintained order. Today, we claim to choose rehabilitation over retribution, yet our prison systems often mirror medieval dungeons in their isolation and despair. The medieval mind saw justice as divine theatre, where God's will played out through human suffering. Modern justice aspires to be more surgical, more scientific, yet we still grapple with the same human impulses toward revenge and social control. The stocks have become ankle monitors, the pillory has become public registries, and the executioner's block has become lethal injection chambers. Perhaps the greatest lesson from medieval justice isn't about their cruelty, but about our capacity for progress. Every abandoned torture device, every demolished scaffold, every reformed law represents humanity's gradual awakening to its own dignity. As you close your eyes tonight, remember that you live in an age where mercy increasingly triumphs over medieval madness, where justice seeks to lift rather than crush the human spirit.